Okay, so we're up to Mem. Pasuk Aleph. Ahi achar hadevarim ha'ele. Choteu mashke melech Mitzrayim v'ha'ofer la'adonihem lemelech Mitzrayim. After this, Choteu. So the story begins with this peer, clearly a peer as we'll discuss. This peer of people that were choite. Now, with this, it continues a theme, because in the last parak, Yosef was afraid that if he'll do a certain evil, then v'chatasi le'lokim. He didn't, but yet he was put in the bar. And then the next story is that two people who were choite join him. Okay, so we can read this as a contrast, or at least continuation of a theme, that he was not choite, and yet unjustly was locked up. They were choite. Now, let's take this idea and go further. We'll soon get to the mashke melech Mitzrayim ha'ofer. Talk about that soon. But first I want to talk about these last three words. La'adonehem lemelech Mitzrayim. To their master, to the king of Egypt. Now, that's clearly repetitive. You can read the pasuk like this. La'adonehem, to their master. You're supposed to read it like this. Yosef didn't sin against his master. They did sin to their master. So in other words, if we read this chatu as a hemshech, he was not chayte, but then these people were chayte, so then the contrast is, okay, his master is Potiphar, he wasn't chayte, they were chayte to their master, who is someone else. He is actually Melech Mitzrayim, and we'll soon see why that's significant in this light also, in this vein too. So now, if you read Pasuk Aleph in the Chatu as a hemshich of the Chatasi Le'Elokim in Perek Lamed Tes, so that leads basically to Gzeira Shava, Chet Chet, which in fact, one man the Medrash says, what was their Chet? That they attempted his daveg lebitoy shel melech. In Dashton's Chet Chet, that is the same nature of Chet as Yosef's. So that's the mashma'is of the fact that there's a continuation here of a question of Chet and whether it deserves jail or not. Okay, now, very interesting thing. So we always know, okay, the Hamashkim did one thing, Sahar did another thing, but like I just told you, the Medrash says in one shot that they were chayte because they were bikshu lehis davik lebite shamelach. Now, that's possibly read as they sinned in unison. And the fact is, you read the parak, you read the pasuk, it talks about chatu, the two of them sinned. Is that a sin in cooperation? And in fact, in pasuk Beis it says Paroi got angry al shnei sarisov, which again is mashma that there was one event, and they both went to jail because he got angry at the two of them. In other words, according to the other famous interpretation, Samashkin did one thing wrong, and Sarah did another thing wrong. One has to understand then, what does the pasuk mean by putting it together? I'm saying Pari got angry at his two Sarisim and put them in jail. It's mashma that there was some, at least it happened simultaneously, maybe it did. But the point is that this suggests, the way the psukim read suggests that there was a cooperation in Chet, and therefore there was a ketzef against the two of them. And indeed, there's another smach to that, because here the pasuk says Vayiktzov Paroi al shnei sarisov, and the whole chain of events, right? And there's another king and his Sarisim and Ketzef and a chain of events, and that's in because Esther, where it says in those days Kotzaf big son v'seresh shnei sarisei hamelech. So again we have two Sarisim, Ketzef, a king, and a plot or something that leads to someone getting gedula, and of course someone being hanged on a tree. So, hanged on a tree, like the Sar HaOfim was hanged on a tree. So the Medrash points this out and says, oh look, Hashem will make a king get angry as his avodim to raise the tzaddik, he'll make an eved get angry at the kings to raise the tzaddik. But the point is that there's this theme over here about the ketzef and the king and how that plays out. And I just want to point at this point that there it's clearly a plot that was hatched in partnership between Bigson and Zeresh. Katzav Bigson v'Zeresh, Neisa v'Yisrael Melech, Mishem Esaf, Vayivakshu l'Shleach Yod. They were doing something together. So similarly, the Ketzef apart al Shnei Suisav, it's mashma that there was some sort of cooperative sin. Okay, now, so like I said, that Manam in the Medrash that says that they were Bikshu, there's David Lebita Shamelech, it could be it was the two of them that were plotting. Fine. Now, so now we're reading this as a continuation. Yosef was almost chayte, but not chayte, and then he was put into the bar unjustly. These two were chayte, and therefore they belonged to be in the bar, and yet one of them was spared and returned to his former position. So Yosef, who wasn't chayte and was in the bar, was then taila his bitachon on the one who was chayte and yet got out of the bar. Okay. Now, let's continue the analysis of this. To their master, the king of Egypt. So we said, one point is, okay, he didn't sin, or Yosef had his problems with his master, and they had a problem with their master. But there's another point here, which is that by stressing L'melech Mitzrayim, remember we discussed this in the last year, that Yosef is always engaged, always dealing with, interacting with Sarim and Malachim. So the point is, he's getting involved in politics, or he's getting carved the malchus. Okay. Now, and then there's another point you could read into the pasuk. You could read it like this: his master is Potiphar, but they sinned to their master, and their master was king of Egypt. Which means then, now that there was another sin, and this was actually a real sin, but it was to the king of Egypt. So now, what's going to determine Yosef's fate is no longer going to be what his connection to his master, because something that supersedes that took place, something that's on a higher level, on upper echelons of the political powers, took place because they sinned to their master, and he's the king of Egypt. So now everything is going to depend on that, and indeed, the connection to the king is what's going to get Yosef out of the bar. So he was put there by Potiphar, by his master, but he's going to be removed by someone else's master, and that's because their master is Melech Mitzrayim. So he overrules Potiphar's decision of putting Yosef in the bar. Okay, fine. So that's how we'll read that pasuk. Now, I want to point out. Now let's go back to. So we spoke about the Chatu and the Hemshech, and we spoke about La'adonehem Melech Mitzrayim, also reading it in the context of a Hemshech. Now I want to talk about the Mashke, Melech Mitzrayim, and the Eifa. So firstly, it's important to note that in the whole parak, consistently, the Sar HaMashkim is mentioned first. Okay? So in this pasuk, in pasuk Aleph, then again in pasuk Beis, and in pasuk Hey, HaMashke v'Ha'oifeh, and the Mashke speaks first in pasuk Tes, and then, of course, the Sar HaOfim speaks, and then in pasuk Chaf, Vayiseh Sar HaMashkim v'Sar HaOfim, and what he did to the Sar HaMashkim, and then what he did to the Sar HaOfim. Okay, so the Sar HaMashkim always comes first. Well, naturally, the Sar HaMashkim is, the fact that he's going to live and the Sar HaOfim is going to die goes along with the fact that he's first. The question is, Hagufa, what is this business? What to make of that? That the Sar HaMashkim lives and the Sar HaOfim dies? Is there something there? Does that mean the Sar HaMashkim is better? Now, we spoke about this a few times. I think we mentioned even last week, the pasuk in Kehelas Perek Yud. And the Perek Yud, which we showed, is Nidrash on this Parsha, Yafa Yafa. And there in Perek Yud, pasuk Yud Tes, it talks about bread and wine and money. So, you make bread for schayk. The purpose of lechem is for schayk. If you want to have schayk, you have to make lechem. No idea what that means. Well, okay. We spoke about that a little bit. But the point is, Yosef, who was involved with the lechem, or not involved with the lechem in the last story, is also not involved with being mitzachik. but he's accused about being Metzachik, but really, since he avoided the Lechem, he is not Metzachik, as we discussed, because Lechem and Schayk go together. And Schayk is a negative, at least in the context of Bereshis. He brought the Evel Tzachik. V'yayin yisamach chayim, but wine is samech chayim. So we spoke about this. The sar ha'ofim is problematic. The sar hamashkim is going to live. Okay. Now, by the way, so yayin seems to be then superior to lechem, that it's misamech chayim. Okay. Of course, I don't know what that means. It's just showing you the remes. What's the oimek? I don't know. But I would add to this another thing, especially related to the Yosef story. In Tehillim, Kuf Chav Zayin, Shir HaMa'alos V'Shuv Hashem Hashivas Tzion, Kuf Chav Vav. So it talks about dreams and alumais, bundles. We spoke about this at the beginning of the Parsha Vayeshev, where Yosef has his dreams about alumim. We spoke about that, Kuf Chav Vav, along with Chav Zayin, which talks about how you could sleep instead of doing lechem matzavim. Okay, but the point is in the Kuf Chav Vav, where it talks about the dreams and the alumis, it says Ozim Ales Chayk Pinu, when we get our bread, right? So when you get your bread, that's when you could have schayk. So it sounds like there's the good schayk and the bad schayk, and we sowed in tears. Only when he's nice alumosav after the geula, that's when he could have the schayk. Maybe I'm not sure exactly what this means, but that there's an association between lechem and schayk. And Yosef was in Golos, of course, and that's where you have to avoid the lechem, as we discussed in the last parak, and the connection to Daniel, who avoided the bread of the goyim. But we'll talk about that more tonight. Akapanim, what am I saying now? I'm just pointing out that there's an association between lechem and schayk, and we see that in the pasuk over there in Keheles and in Tehillim. And Yosef, in the last parak, by avoiding the lechem, it's really innocent of the schayk that he's charged with. But there's a lechem could be dangerous, and while yain is sameh chayim. And indeed in this parak, the sar hamashkim lives. Sar ha'ofim dies. Okay. Now, by the way, I had a question. So, of course, we know the sar hamashkim is going to live and sar ha'ofim is going to die. So I wonder who's in sar ha'ofim. There's a position. There's a position that has to be filled, right? There's a sar ha'ofim. Who's in sar ha'ofim? So you might say, oh, well, it's Yosef, because Yosef is in charge of the bread. And okay, maybe that's true. But another thing is, in other words, what I mean to say it's true. I mean to say when the parak sets up, okay, this mashkim, mashkim gets reinstated, mashkim gets hanged, sort of left hanging with the sarayfim, but then there's Yosef who's going to be in charge of bread. It makes perfect sense. But another point is that pasuk in Kehelah says, so as we mentioned last week, Yosef said to Paro, "Lekim ya'anesh shleim Paroi," and Yosef collects all the kesef. Right? Yosef collects all the kesef that's in Mitzrayim. That's the end of Parshas. That's the end of Parshas Vayigash, right? He got all the kesef. Vayilakit Yosef es kol kesef. So a kesef ya'anes hakol, because he brought it to Paro. So there's lechem, there's yayin, but kesef covers it all. Okay, so that's like there's hamashkim, there's ha'ofim, but then there's what Yosef can do, which is get the kesef, is maybe even better. Okay, now another thing about just focusing on the fact that we're dealing with the hamashkim and the ha'ofim. So we have wine and bread now. Okay, so it's a major focus on food, right? And of course, Yosef is all about food. Now, to note, there are three sets of dreams, basically, in the Yosef story, right? Yosef has two dreams, then there's the Mashkim Sarifim, those two dreams, and Paro has two dreams. Yosef's two dreams are about the sun, stars, and the moon, and then about the grain. Mashkim Sarifim, one is about the bread, and one is about wine and bread. And so to Paro, one is about cows, and one is about grain. So in each of the three sets is one that's explicitly about bread. Another point, and I don't go into this tonight, but it might be significant, is that, okay, there's a mashke and there oife, right? So mashke is about liquid. And in Paro's dreams, the paras come out from the oir. And of course, that's very significant because the whole might of Mitzrayim is, as the pasuk says in Parash Lech, Kula mashke, Kigan Hashem Ke'etz Mitzrayim. There's a place of mashke, which makes it very fertile. So, Sar HaMashkim, Sar HaOfim might be significant for that reason. Okay. Now, I want to just review something. This is something we started discussing, but now we have to get back into it. So we have the Sar HaMashkim, Sar HaOfim. These are sarim of food, specific foods in a foreign kingdom. So very important. As we mentioned, Yosef, we discussed a little bit in Perek Lamed. Yosef avoids the bread, as does Daniel avoid the bread of his master, the king of Bavel. And Daniel becomes a dream interpreter. And you read Daniel Perek Aleph, it's pretty clear that, because he avoided the Pas Akum, that's who becomes a dream interpreter. So then Yosef too, in the last Perek, doesn't eat the lechem, and then he gets this power to interpret dreams. Okay. Now, another thing is that in Perek Aleph of Daniel, we have this expression when the Daniel had chesed and rachamim l'fnei sar hasarisim, which, by the way, of course, reminds us of then the Perek Lamed Tes, that Yosef had chesed in front of the sar beis hasoyer, so he could not eat bread if he doesn't want to, as it says in Daniel. But when Daniel requested not to eat the food of the king and rather to eat seeds, so the sar sarisim said, I'm afraid that the king, lama yirez panechem zoyafim, he's going to see that your faces are zoyafim. Now, this panechem zoyafim, of course, we have in Perek Mem, where Yosef comes to the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim, and V'hinam zoyafim, and he says, Madua panechem roem hayom. So Daniel didn't want to eat the bread and the wine of the king, and the Sar HaSarisim said, well, I'm afraid that you're going to be panechem zoyafim. Now here's the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim, bread and the wine of the king, boom. And they are Panechem Zoyafim, right? And then and Yosef says to them, Madua Panechem Roim. Madua Panechem Roim. Now, this Madua Panechem Roim, this brings us to another Sar Mashke, which is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the Mashke Lamelech. And as it says in Perek Beis of Nehemiah, that he was careful not to be cheerful in front of the king, but one day he was very upset because he was very upset about the state of Yerushalayim. And the king said to him, Madua Panechem Roim. Right? Okay, and it was a big problem. It was very scary for him that the king accused him of having Panecha Royam. He's a Mashke Lamelech. He's supposed to have a good cheer. Right. Okay, so we have to understand what that's all about. But I'm just bringing out this HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim are very significant in terms of the Jew in Golos, let's call it, who must avoid the Pas and the Yayin, as Daniel did. But by the way, you could contrast that to Nehemiah, who was actually the Mashke Lamelech. So here we have two stories of people in the king's court. One is Daniel, who avoids the Pas Bag HaMelech and Yein Mishtov. The other one is Nehemiah, who is actually the Mashke Lamelech. And the Yerushalmi says in Kedushin, he's called Tirshas because they were Matir Shtir, got a heter of Yain. But either way, what am I bringing out? Just that this parsha of this two Sar Mashkim, Sar HaOfim, the two Sarim of the king, about his food, and about is clearly related to these other parshas about the king's food and a youth in captivity. That's Daniel, and someone who actually is the Sar HaMashkim, and that's Nehemiah. And in both of those stories, we have this theme of how they look. Right? Again, Daniel, his master, the Sar Sarisim, was worried that if he doesn't eat the Pas Mela, the Pas and the Yein Akum, he's going to be Panechem Zoyafim, and it's going to be a problem. Yosef comes to the jail and sees Sar HaMashkim, Sar HaOfim, Panechem Zoyafim, which is very concerning to him and makes him wonder. And similarly, Nehemiah, who was the Mashke Lamelech, he was Panav Ro'im, and that was a problem. Okay, now Yosef, as we discussed in Perek Lamed Tes, Yosef avoids the bread, and as we mentioned just now, that earlier, that Yosef, as it says in Perek Lamed Tes Pasuk Chaf Aleph, he had chesed in the eyes of the Sar Beis Asaya. So like Daniel, who had chesed and was able therefore to use the fact that he had chesed to avoid eating the bread and the yayin of the goyim. Okay, so here's Yosef, and I don't know exactly how it works out. I'm just pointing out the connection that Yosef now is in jail with the Sar Mashkin. Very interesting. Okay, now the Maisa. So Yosef avoids the bread. Now it says in, of course, we mentioned this pasuk numerous times. It says in Parak Kofhei that when it's describing the sequence of events of going down to Mitzrayim, etc., it says about the story of Yosef. Vayikra Rav ala Aretz kol mate lechem shavar shalach lefneim ish le'evanim kayosef. So Hashem decreed a Rav, and he broke the power of lechem, and he sent an ish before them. Yosef was sold as an eved. So Hashem declared a Rav, and he paved the way to protect us from the Rav by sending Yosef. Okay, so there's an interesting lashon over there that kol mate lechem shavar. Okay, kol mate lechem shavar. Of course, remember that from the Chukei side, b'chashivi lechem mate lechem. But there's another place where we have this expression. That's in Yechezkel Perek Dalet. Hashem told Yechezkel to basically take bread, and it's a whole mix of all different kinds of wheat and kitnias. Wheat, barley, of grain and kitnias. Wheat, barley, pul, adoshim, lentils, and doichen and kusmin. Okay, and basically that's what you have to eat. Plus you have to weigh it out, a certain amount per every 24 hours. You have to weigh out your water. And Hashem told him to bake it on human dung as a sign of Kocha Yochlu Bnei Yisrael's Lachmum Tomei Bagoyim Asher Adichim Sham. That when they're rejected and sent to the Goyim, they're going to eat Lechem Tomei. So what exactly is Lechem Tomei? I don't know. But the Tanchuma says, this is a decree that when those are in Golos, they're going to have to eat Pas Goyim, which is called Lechem Tomei. And Daniel said, okay, but I don't want to do it. So there's a decree that in Golos is Lechem Tomei, and that's the whole story of Daniel. He's avoiding the Lechem Tomei. Now, okay, so Daniel says, but I was never Tomei before, so I don't want to do this. So Hashem said, okay, you could use cattle dung instead of human dung. And then the next pasuk says, Ben Adam hineni shover mati lechem b'Yushalayim, and they're going to weigh out their bread. So we see that lechem tomei and mati lechem shover go together. The hainu mati lechem shover. So there's galus, v'avadat mehera, right? Me'ala etz hateva. Instead, so Hashem breaks the lechem in Canaan, and it's Yisrael. Then we have to go to Eretz Mitzrayim or somewhere else, and then we eat lechem tomei. So that's what we have in the Yosef stories. Hashem breaks the mati lechem, shalach v'neim ish, who avoids the lechem tomei. Okay, now another point about the mashke and the ofer, which I think we may have mentioned in the past. I don't know what to make of this, but it's interesting. Yosef is in a pit. Now he's in a pit for the second time, right? First time he was in a bar, as the pasuk says, there was no lechem. There's no mayim. I'm sorry. A bar rake ain't by mayim, by yeshvu lechol lechem. Now, which implying also that he has no lechem either. And in a pit, you have a problem, which is that you have no lechem, you have no mayim. Here, Yosef is in a pit, and he has a sahar mashkim and a sahar opim. Just the two things you would like to have with you in a bar. Additionally, we have the same thing in Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Ches. We spoke about this a lot, how Yirmiyah is like similar to Yosef. And in Yirmiyah Perek, many ways, we're going to that in Yirmiyah Perek Lamed Ches, Yirmiyah is put into a bar. And as the pasuk says, Perek Lamed Ches Yud, Babar ein mayim. Okay. Meanwhile, Eved Melech Kushi heard about this, and he tells the king, this is no good, that they put Yirmiyah into a bar. He's going to die of hunger. Ki ein halechem oid be'ir. There's no lechem. So they took Yirmiyah out of the bar, and they I think they gave him a certain amount of bread. Okay, it doesn't matter. The point is that when you're in a pit, you have to worry about obviously having water, and also if there's not an abundance of lechem, there's big trouble for you in a pit. So here Yosef is in the bar, and he has sahar mashkim, sahar opim in a bar. Okay, just noting it. I don't know how to put all these things together. Hopefully we'll learn more as we go along. Pasuk Beis Vayik Tzoif. paroi al shnei serisov al sahamashkim al sahar eifim. So very important. It's not just that they were chayte and they got punished. It introduces that something happened. Paroi was quite safe. So you could read this as a introduction to the next pasuk, which is E49 b'mishmar. We'll stop at that word for now. For tonight, I just want to talk about that. What does that mean? E49 b'mishmar. So Yosef B'chashar and others show that Mishmar is a place where you put someone for watching, right? Like it says by the Mekaish, to put by the Mekalo. What does it say? They put him into a Mishmar. Lifresh lahem api Hashem. So they just find out what to do. And also by the Mekaishish, Kiloi Parish Ma'azaloi. So you put someone in a Mishmar, and like it says by Yosef, you lock them in a Mishmar, Shloishis Yamim. A Mishmar is not a place you dump someone, it's a place you put someone for guarding until you figure out what to do with him. And indeed, in our story, sometime later, Paroi starts figuring out, okay, time to figure out what to do with them. So this is not just a punishment, it's Vayiktzov Paroi, he gets angry. And this is reaction. We have to put them in Mishmar because till Paroi figures out what to do. It's not that there was no judgment that was determined what their punishment should be, but rather there was a ketzef, and therefore they had to be put away until to be determined what should be done with them. Okay, and then there's another point over here, perhaps we mentioned this in the past too. Paroi is kaitseif, right? And the Sahar Mashkim references this, and he says Paroi katzef alavodav. Aha. So Paroi has a temper. Okay, we can say. Now, we've been mentioning numerous times that Daniel parallels the Yosef story. Daniel doesn't eat the lechem and he becomes a Pesach Halomis, right? And Daniel's story, look in Daniel Perek Beis, what happened was the king has a dream and he needs someone to interpret it. And all his wise men cannot interpret it. And this is a theme, that the Yehudi who's in Golos is able to surpass the Sorim and the Chacham of Bavel, like Yosef, who's in Golos, is able to be wise, prove himself to be wiser and greater than the Sarim and Chachmei. It's right, okay, same thing. But the point is that in that story, what happens is no one can interpret. All the wise men of Babel can't interpret the king's dream, for whatever reason. He wanted them to tell him what the dream was and interpret it because he actually forgot the dream. But the pasuk says like this. The pasuk says in Daniel Perek Beis, pasuk Beis, the king was a great ketzef, and he started wiping out all the Chachmei Bavel. And they were starting to get killed. They were killing out Chachmei Bavel. So Daniel told Aryech, the chief Tabachim, hey, what are you doing? Why are you killing the Chachmei Bavel? He said, oh, because this is what's going on. So Daniel said, okay, listen, give me some time, and I will solve this problem. So similarly, when Paroi has a dream, and none of his Chatumim and Chachamim could interpret it, so the Chachmei Mitzrayim are at great risk from Paroi's ketzef. So the Sahar Mashkim, and who's in charge of executing the Paroi's ketzef? The Sahar Tabachim, like Aryech Rav Katolaya in Daniel. So Potiphar says Sahar Tabachim is the one who's going to kill the Kol Chachmei Bavel, Kol Chachmei Mitzrayim. So the Sahar Mashkim speaks up and says, oh, Paroi kotzef alavodav. The fact that there's a ketzef is what makes the Sahar Mashkim be very worried about the very important need to make sure that Paroi gets his dream interpreted before he kills all the Chachmei Mitzrayim v'Sarav. Okay, we will stop at that.